Then it became the challenge of, wow, how do you go from, because we had all the investment income from the 60 units, in order to become a car dealer, you had to have cash. That meant we had to sell all of our apartments. So we did that. We put them all up for sale. We sold all of them in a relatively short window, like 60 days. So we sold them. We had the investment. It was a minimum of $100,000 capital requirement. So now we had the over $100,000 in cash that we needed to purchase a dealership or to get accepted into a dealer training program that Ford Motor Company had. To put that in perspective, we went from making the equivalent of over $100,000 a year in 1986 to selling cars. In my first year, I made $37,000, and that was a gut check. That was a real gut check, because it was like, wow, how do we live on this? Well, by grace, and fortunately, because we were always trying to live on my check and save or invest my wife's, our bills were low. Our mortgage was $486. Back then, our car note was $200, and we wound up paying off our car, so we had no car note. So really, we just had a $486 mortgage, and even though we're making a lot less, we were able to do okay. At that time, we had one child. Our first daughter was born in January 3rd, 1984. Our second daughter was born January 23rd, 1987. And then our third child, Karen, was born April 8th, 1988. So while I was selling cars, so now you have three children, 2 in diapers, and you're broke. Making $3,000 a month, 100% commission. In those days there was no salary, so you're just making 100% commission. It was really, really tough, really, really challenging. So, growing up in Detroit, we lived in Northwest Detroit, which was one of the nicer areas of the city. Our neighbors literally were Marvin Gaye, Berry Gordy, Paul from the Temptations, and Aretha Franklin. So they lived, that's where they lived. Berry Gordy, all those guys lived right in our neighborhood. It was pretty cool. And they were just kids, you didn't think of them as, you knew it was Aretha Franklin's son, but you didn't really think about it. And you knew it was the Temptations, Paul's son, but you didn't think about it. It was just regular kids playing in the street. It was pretty cool. In Detroit, it's such a heavy influence of GM, Ford, and Chrysler. So many of our friends' parents worked for the Big Three. At that time, we called them the Big Three. That when I graduated from college, of course, as an engineer, I thought, oh, I'm going to work for the Big Three. After the end of my junior year, I actually had an internship with Oldsmobile in Lansing, Michigan. And Oldsmobile hired me as an engineer for a value engineering position in their purchasing department. So my responsibility, one of them, was to work with engineering and purchasing as they value engineer a particular part to see if it's the most efficient part possible, or if there are any ways that we can make that part so it's easily manufactured to give us the best price. So my first position in engineering was actually as a value engineer for the purchasing department at Oldsmobile. Oldsmobile in 1976 and 1977 delivered over 1 million vehicles, which was amazing. They were only the third company to deliver 1 million vehicles. The first was Ford, the second was Chevrolet division, and then Oldsmobile. And of course, it's just shocking that they eventually went out of business for lack of sales, but that's a different story. We're working at Whitman Ford in Temperance, Michigan. Sold cars there for a year. We're trained there in the Ford Motor Company dealer development program for 18 months. So we're there 2.5 years. The training program is 18 to 24 months. around month 18, 16 to 18, you begin looking for a dealership to purchase. So the way dealerships at that time became available for sale, most dealers would contact the manufacturer. The manufacturer would have a list of candidates, and you would interview with the manufacturer, and they would put you then in contact with the dealer that's selling. You would negotiate a purchase. So I actually went to a dealer meeting in Miami, Florida, and in the meeting, attending the meeting, were all the senior executives for Ford Motor Company. So there was a cocktail reception from 6 to 7, and then there was, of course, the dinner and awards reception from 7 to 9 p.m. So one of the things I've always noticed about cocktail receptions is that no one's ever there on time. Just a few people lingering around. So I said, you know what, I'm going to go down and I'm going to be early and see who I can meet. So I go down to the reception early. I'm there at like 5 minutes to 6. And there's one little short guy standing there. And so he said, hi, I'm Nate. He says, hi, I'm Al. And we just started talking. And, you know, where are you from? Where I'm from, grew up in Detroit, living in Toledo. And I'm, you know, living in Toledo. And I said, so what do you do? He said, oh, I work for Ford. And I said, he said, so what do you do in your fun times? I said, oh, and we started talking about horses. And I said, oh, I love horses. He said, really? My daughter loves horses. I said, really? She said, yeah, she competes. And we talked about quarter horses. Quarter horses are the second fastest horse. Actually, they run longer races than thoroughbreds. But we talked about horses literally for 45 minutes. And we were in our own little world talking about horses and competitions and, you know, what type of property, how much land it takes to feed them, and everything you want to know about a horse. We talked about horses. And we both looked around. It was 6:45, and the room was full. And we were totally oblivious to the room being full. And we went, and he went, oh my gosh, I need to mingle. And I said, yeah, me too. I said, by the way, what do you do at Ford? And he said, I'm the national market rep manager. And I went, oh my gosh, I blew it. I've been talking to you for 45 minutes about horses. I'm a dealer candidate. I'm looking to buy a dealership. And he said, oh, where? I said, I'm open anywhere east of the Mississippi. He said, oh, that's a lot of territory. Okay, I'll be in touch. And I said, wait a minute. He said, can I have your card? And he says, sure. And he gives me his card, and I'm thinking, oh, what a disaster that was. I have the #1 guy in Ford Motor Company that sees every single dealership for sale in the entire country. And I spent 45 minutes talking about horses. Oh my God, I was just miserable. And the rest of the night was like, oh, what a dummy, right? So I get back to Temperance, Michigan, sitting at my desk when I call, and hello, Mr. Clanky's office. And I said, hi, this is Nate Sutton. I met Mr. Clanky in Miami. Is he available? She says, no, he's not available, but I'll let him know you call. And that went on for like 3 weeks. And I was like, that guy probably thinks I'm a real idiot. We talked 45 minutes about horses. So another month went by. Then another month. It was like 90 days later. And I'm like, I don't know where I'll get a dealership. And the phone rings in Temperance, Michigan. And it's a lady, and she says, Mr. Sutton. I said, yes. I have Al Clanky on the line. He'd like to talk to you. I said, are you available? And I said, yeah. And he said, Nate, Al. I said, how are you? He says, oh, I'm great. Listen, I've not been ignoring your messages. I've been really busy, and I didn't have a dealership for you. But there's one for sale in Chicago I'd like you to go look at. I said, okay. He said, okay, the guy over there is Jim Travers. He's expecting your call. My secretary will give you his information. Have a great week. I got to go. Talk to you. Bye, bye. Click. And that was it. So I called Jim Travers. He says, oh, come on over. So I go over, and I never interviewed. It was kind of like "Hi, I'm Jim. Here's the dealership. Would you like it?" And I was like, yes. Now, prior to coming to Chicago, they had sent me all the financials. They had sent me all the information about the dealership. So we drove up, we drove the community, we drove around the dealership. We actually shopped the dealership to see how they handled their customers at that time. It was Olympia Fields Ford in Olympia Fields, Illinois. And so by the time we got to meet the regional office, we had done all of our homework and knew that this was like a dream come true to be able to buy this dealership. And so he said, "Okay, it's yours if you want it." So we're like, "Great." And he says, "You need $500,000. And I said, "No problem." He said, "Okay, do your forecast and we'll get the paperwork to you." I said, "Okay." So then I'm like, "Okay, Lord, where do I come up with $500,000? I have 100. Actually, I had 120. So I called my dad. I said, "Dad, I need 30 grand. He said, "Okay." So he sends me $30,000. I said, "I need my inheritance," is what I said. And he said, "Your inheritance? What are you talking about?" I said, I'm short. I need another $30,000 to get in the game at Ford. And so he gave me $30,000. And that was 150. And then he said, "I need $500,000. So I had 150. And when I went to the meeting, he said, "I need $500,000. I was like, "Oh my gosh." So I just smiled and said, "Okay." And I thought to myself, well, Lord, you have a problem because I've done everything I'm supposed to do. So you figure out how this other 350 grand is going to appear. So I get back to Temperance and I'm thinking, how in the world am I going to come up with $350,000? And John, my buddy, says, "Nate, my dad and I would like to meet with you." I said, "John, I'm really busy. I really don't have time. Thinking to myself, I got to find 350 grand. He said, "Well, will you at least meet with us and listen to what we got to say?" I said, "Sure." So I go in his office and he says, "We want to invest with you." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "We want to be your partner." I said, "My partner?" He said, "Yeah, we got $500,000. We're willing to invest with you to buy a dealership." I said, "What? Are you kidding me?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, there's a dealership in Chicago for sale and we need $500,000. Let's do it." And so he became my partner. He loaned me $100,000. So he loaned me 100 grand. So I was 250 and 51%, and they put in 49, and that was $500,000 total, and we bought the dealership.